Thanks for joining us today. For the last several lessons, we've been studying the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and then showing how in a roundabout way, the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus is actually historical evidence for the existence of God. So what we've done is we've looked at all these historical facts. Things that the vast majority of historians, whether, no matter what their worldview, from atheists to Christians and everybody in between, the vast majority of historians hold that certain things are true about Jesus, the historical person of Jesus. Now, this doesn't mean that they assume that Jesus is God or that there's anything special about Jesus. They just say, hey, Jesus was a real person of history, and there's some things we can know about him historically that you don't have to accept on faith or anything like that. So we've been looking at these historical facts. Now, we've laid out all these facts and said, now, we have to connect these dots. How do you fit this all these puzzle pieces to make a picture? Or how do you tell a story that's consistent with all of these facts? Now, some people don't want Christianity to be true. I've said it before, I don't understand why anybody wouldn't want the teachings of Jesus to be true. I mean, Jesus tells us that he represents God and that God wants everybody to love him in return because he loves you. And then he wants everybody to love everybody, even those who consider you an enemy. Love them. Desire the best for them. Jesus gives the parable of the Good Samaritan and says, go out of your way to make sure they flourish and prosper. I mean, can you imagine if everybody followed the teachings of Jesus? This would be an awesome place to live, much better than the place we live right now. But if we actually followed the teachings of Jesus, this would be a great place. It would be as close to heaven on earth as you can get. But some people really don't want Christianity to be true. They don't want it to be the case that God raised Jesus from the dead. And by the way, if God raised Jesus from the dead, I've said this before, but if God raised Jesus from the dead, then at least some flavor of Christianity is true. As C.S. Lewis called it, mere Christianity would be true. But if God did not raise Jesus from the dead, then Christianity is false. Paul says that much in the New Testament. So it really hinges on the fact that if God raised Jesus from the dead, then Christianity is true. At least some flavor of Christianity. So, we've looked at, here's my point. Some people don't want that to be true. They don't want Christianity to be true, and so they try to find another way to explain these historical facts, apart from the resurrection. Now, we've said that the resurrection hypothesis can make sense of all the facts, and even the ones that aren't on this board. Okay? So we've got all these historical facts, and the resurrection hypothesis can explain all of them. But others say, no, the resurrection can't be true, so they offer other possible explanations. But when you push on those explanations, they crumble quickly. And so we look on the board here, we looked at everything from how can we explain some of these things? The women were confused, the disciples just really wanted it to be true, or there's some conspiracy theory going on here. They went to the wrong tomb. Aliens, we talk about aliens, Jesus had a twin brother, and the most common is, people were just hallucinating. But we've been looking at these possible explanations, and they fall apart. That is to say, they're not good explanations. Sure, maybe a hallucination might explain one, but it can't explain the other. Maybe an alien interfering or Jesus had a twin brother might explain one, but it can't explain the other facts. And so if you have an explanation that can, let's say you've got 5 facts that you need to explain, and you've got a possible explanation that can explain 2 facts, well, that's great. But then if you have another possible explanation that explains 3, then that's a better explanation than the one that explains 2. So you say the inference to the best explanation there is the one that can explain 3 of the 5 facts. But if you have an explanation that's possibly true, and it can explain all 5 of the facts, then the inference to the best explanation, given everything that we've examined, that's the one that can explain all the facts. So you picked that one. And I'm telling you, the resurrection hypothesis is the only one, after 2,000 years of looking for other possible answers, other possible explanations. The resurrection hypothesis is the one that can explain all of the facts. That is to say, the resurrection of Jesus Christ is the inference to the best explanation after examining all of the historical facts. Let's review the argument I began this series with. It's a three-step syllogism, or I should say, it's three premises leading to a final deductive conclusion. Let's take a look. Premise 1. There are some facts that need an explanation. 2. The best explanation of these facts is that God raised Jesus from the dead. 3. If God raised Jesus from the dead, then God exists. Final step, deductive conclusion. Therefore, God exists. Okay, so we've got here an argument for the resurrection and for the existence of God in 4 simple steps. All right, we've addressed some possible objections in the past, in the last few episodes, so let's look now at some final potential problems. I've had this offered to me before. An atheist coming to me and saying, I don't care what you say, Jesus rising from the dead is a miracle. And the chances of a miracle happening are so small that it will always be easier to not believe the things that the disciples said. But the thing is, that's not a good explanation because we've already looked carefully at the historical facts. Talking about chances, the chances of these historical facts being facts if Jesus did not rise from the dead are even smaller. Let me say that again. The chances of these historical facts, if Jesus did not rise from the dead, are even smaller. Think about those chances. What are the chances that we would have all this historical data pointing that the resurrection is the best explanation if the resurrection didn't happen? Think about those chances. So anyway, we've also seen that all of the other explanations are more difficult to believe. They're not good and they can't make sense of all the facts. Be that as it may, this chance objection is just silly. When someone announces the winning lottery number on TV, well, the chance of that specific number being picked is extremely small. So, should we not believe him when he reads, say that he's reading the number on your ticket, right? And he's reading the number that you're holding, you're looking at it, and you're like, the chances of me winning the lottery are so small that surely I'm not going to believe it when he reads my number, saying that I should win the billions of dollars. No, that doesn't make any sense at all. The chance that he would announce that number, if it actually wasn't picked, is even smaller also. And plus, we've got no reason to think he's mistaken. So unless you have a good argument that he's mistaken when he reads this number, you shouldn't jump to the conclusion that he's wrong. Here's the bottom line. Something being improbable does not make something impossible. Right? So the resurrection is a possible hypothesis. It's a possible explanation. And it's the only one that can make sense of all the facts, even if one wants to say it's improbable. But improbable things happen all the time. Now, someone might say, also, well, we hear so many silly stories of ghosts and UFOs and monsters, like Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster, things like that, and all these other kinds of miracles. So Jesus rising from the dead is just another one of these silly stories, which we also shouldn't believe. But there's some glaring differences here with this resurrection hypothesis and these, Loch Ness Monster stories. Many ghost or miracle stories are different, or, alien stories. These are different kinds of things. The facts are usually not very good in these situations. The facts are usually pretty sketchy. And typically, people are expecting to see something, right? I mean, you'll have these TV shows of people going out and looking for Bigfoot. And what do you know? Oh, I think I just got a glimpse of him. Well, they're hoping to see it. They're wanting to see it. They're expecting to see it. They're going out to find him, right? And then these are the people that you usually see. Yeah, I'm sure I saw something. Yeah, that's it. So they're expecting to see it. The disciples weren't in that situation at all. They saw Jesus dead. Paul definitely wasn't expecting it, right? He's the wild card in this whole thing. Paul would be the last person who would expect to see the risen Jesus. And plus, these people going out looking for aliens and Bigfoot and Loch Ness Monster, whatever. I mean, ghosts. These people usually aren't killed or are really willing to die for what they saw. I mean, we don't see anybody who's going out and looking for Bigfoot. Our government is not threatening to kill them or torture them or imprison them if they say anything about Bigfoot. No, in fact, if you see Bigfoot, you'll get some money, you'll get a TV show, right? We encourage people saying those kinds of things. That's a completely different situation. This is what was going on here a couple thousand years ago. The government was threatening to kill, to torture, to imprison people talking about Jesus. Yet they were doing it anyway. They were willing to die for their testimony that Jesus rose from the dead and that they experienced him. They touched him. They had conversations with him. They were willing to die for it, and many did. If you really want to know what happened, you must always look carefully at the facts. And that's what we've done over the past few episodes or past few lessons here. So we've already looked carefully at all the historical facts about Jesus' death. So you still have to say, you have to ask yourself this question: what do you think is the best explanation of the historical facts? Now, I'd really like to encourage you to do more research of your own regarding the historicity of the resurrection and the historical person of Jesus. Dr. Craig has a good place to start, a chapter that he wrote in his book called On Guard. I recommend that. It's a good, if you want just a little chapter on the subject, that's really good. But then I encourage you to look at a book written by Mike Licona and Gary Habermas. And yeah, you've got it here. The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. Did yours come with a little computer disc in the back?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that thing is awesome. Here, let me show it to The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. Written by Gary Habermas and Mike Licona. Highly recommended. This is a great book to start with. And yeah, there's a little disc in the back here. The Resurrection Challenge. You can put it in your computer, and it's like a game show host comes on, and you're a contestant on a game show, and he's asking these questions, and you can answer them and win the game. It's pretty cool. And while you're answering, you're learning how to have these conversations about the historical resurrection. It's pretty cool. Thank you. Now, that's a good place to start, but if you really want to go deeper and delve deeper into this topic, Mike Licona has also written what I consider to be the standard on the historical resurrection, and that's just called The Resurrection of Jesus. And it's about an 800-page book, but it's very thorough. Highly recommend it. I think I consider Mike to be, the guy to go to when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus. So let's review the argument one more time, and then I'm going to add just a little bit to it. So once again, the argument goes like this. Premise 1, there are some facts that need an explanation. 2, the best explanation of these facts is that God raised Jesus from the dead. 3, If God raised Jesus from the dead, then God exists. Conclusion. Therefore, God exists. All right, so there's our first 4 steps, but now we're going to add to it. Step 5. If God raised Jesus from the dead, then Jesus is who he said he is. 6. If Jesus is who he said he is, we should worship and believe in Jesus. Final conclusion. 7. Therefore, we should worship and believe in Jesus. And why? Because if God raised Jesus from the dead, then Christianity is true. And if you want to correspond to reality, well, truth corresponds to reality. So if you want to correspond with reality, which isn't that a good thing? You should worship Jesus. Here's the thing. In this final argument here, we've got an argument for the resurrection, a historical argument for the resurrection, then an argument for the existence of God, and then for the truth of Christianity. So I encourage you to rewind, watch that argument again, take notes. But if God raised Jesus from the dead, then some form of Christianity is true. And there's definitely other important issues, but that's what you start with. William Lane Craig gives a great example of a spider web. And so at the core of the spider web, it's God's existence. Then the next strand out is the resurrection. And then, you start getting out farther and farther, and you get into things like baptism and, the whole God's sovereignty and human freedom debate and things like that. These are all more peripheral issues. Spiritual gifts, what spiritual gifts are they around today? Are they not? I mean, we can argue about those. But, if you pluck out one of those strands, say you're a strong Calvinist and it turns out Calvinism is false, right? Which I think it is, but you take one of those, you break that strand, well, it might send a reverberation through the entire spider web. You'll feel it. But Christianity, the web of Christianity is still true, you see. It's still there. But if you go to the center of that spider web and you pluck out God's existence or pluck out the resurrection of Jesus, well, the whole thing just collapses and falls apart. So, you see, so my point is, as C.S. Lewis called it, mere Christianity. That's the core of our web of beliefs, if you will. The cool thing is we have very good evidence, many arguments, pointing to the existence of God, and a historical argument showing that Jesus did rise from the dead. It was a real event in history. So you see, it's not just a blind faith that Christians have. No. It's a reasonable faith. We have reasons to believe what we believe. And that belief is quite encouraging. Just being encouraged doesn't make it true. But when things happen to be true, and then if they are really true, that gives you inspiration and encouragement and hope. Well, that's just great. It reminds me of Paul's words in 1 Thessalonians 4. He says, we believe that Jesus died and rose again. And so we believe that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep in him, those who have died already. For the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet call of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. And after that, those who are still alive and are left will be caught together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so we will be with the Lord forever. Therefore, encourage each other with these words. Encourage each other with these words. You see, because Jesus rose from the dead, we have encouragement to carry on. Because Jesus rose from the dead, so can you. Think about that. Because Jesus rose from the dead, so can you. Your life doesn't end at the grave, you see. If this resurrection is true and the historical evidence points to the fact that it is true, you see, if that's true, your life does not end at the grave because Jesus did it. He defeated death. And so he defeated your death too, if you accept his grace and his love. Don't resist it. Don't resist him. Don't reject him. He wants the most for you. He loves you. Your life does not have to end at the grave. You see, but think about the other end of the spectrum here. There's no hope if this isn't true, especially on atheism. Think about atheism here. It's dust in the wind. I mean, if atheism is true, there's no legacy you're going to ultimately leave. Sure, maybe you can leave a legacy that people might remember for a few short years. But ultimately, everyone dies. Everyone. Including the entire universe. I mean, scientists tell us that left to our own naturalistic devices, the universe will be destroyed. Utterly destroyed, and every person in it. You're not going to leave a legacy. No one will remember your name. If atheism is true, ultimately speaking. You know, that was what Achilles was worried about. He wanted people to remember his name forever. On atheism, that doesn't happen. And then I think of the movie Gladiator. What does Maximus say? He's inspiring his troops. He says, "What we do now echoes in eternity." Well, that's only true if God exists. And I would even say if Christianity is true. I would argue that. But think about, on atheism, like I said, it's just dust in the wind. And that makes me think of the great philosophers in the band known as Kansas from the 1970s. When I grew up with, I remember being a little kid. I had these little records, these 45 records. That's how old I am. And I would play, it was the first record, little 45 singles, what they call them. And my dad bought me this record. First song I ever had, Dust in the Wind. And I think he got me The Devil Went Down to Georgia also. That's one of the two songs I remember. But it's good theology in that song right there. But Dust in the Wind is a song from an atheistic perspective, really. And he's right. If atheism is true, we're nothing more than dust in the wind. Look at this line that he says. All we do crumbles to the ground, though we refuse to see. That's what you're left with on atheism. Everything you do is going to crumble to the ground, even if you refuse to see it, even if you refuse to think about it. Everything we do, if atheism is true, crumbles to the ground. It's destroyed. Sure, become president of the United States, big deal. Ultimately, that's nothing. It's going to be destroyed, and no one will remember your name. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Yeah, they might remember it a little bit longer than they'll remember me, but ultimately, you leave no legacy. Sure, become a doctor or a scientist and cure cancer. Cure all humanity from cancer. That'd be great. But guess what? We're all going to die anyway. And so are you. If atheism is true, your life ends at the grave, and you might just extend people's lives for a few more years, maybe a few more decades, but ultimately, we all die anyway. And if your life ends at the grave, that's meaningless. But that band of philosophers known as Kansas also wrote another song called Carry On My Wayward Son. And that song seems to have been written with a different worldview in mind. And it's a lot more positive. They sing this. Now your life's no longer empty. Surely heaven waits for you. Think about that. Now your life's no longer empty. Surely heaven waits for you. You see, heaven is waiting for you. Jesus loves you, and he defeated death. And the historical facts demonstrate that that's true. He defeated death, and heaven waits for you. God the Father loves you. Jesus says in John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father in heaven but through me. And I'm telling you this. God, Jesus loves you and desires you to spend eternity with him in paradise. He loves you. You might be watching this right now. I know there's atheists out there watching me, because I'm friends with a lot of you guys. And I know you watch me. And you might say you don't even believe in God, but I know you might even say you hate the idea of God. You hate the idea of Christianity being true, which doesn't make sense to me, because everybody would love everybody if we all followed the teachings of Jesus, even if we disagreed with each other. But you might hate the idea of God for some reason. That doesn't mean he doesn't exist. And you might hate the idea of God, but he still loves you. He still loves you. He desires a personal relationship with you. Heaven waits for you. And because of that, the things we do now aren't meaningless. As Maximus says, the things we do now echo in eternity. If that's true, if Maximus was right, then the things we do right now actually have meaning and purpose. Now your life's no longer empty because Jesus rose from the dead. Surely heaven waits for you. I'll tell you this. The only people who don't go to heaven are the ones that just don't want to go to heaven. I believe that ultimately it's your choice. But I do know this. The creator of the universe loves you more than you can imagine.